Well, he was...
She's not back in much.
So, and we had sort of texted him to say, because we had told him that he was, but then we realized that there was going to be an issue with the flight.
Right.
So we had tried to get him word that if he could get back sooner, we would try and call him sooner.
All right, well, let's bring the jurors back in, and if he is not here when we're ready to start, we'll put Mr. Bierman on, and if this other witness shows up with consent of the state, we'll interrupt Mr. Bierman's testimony and swap the witnesses around.
Thank you.
Jurors, please. Yes, please. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I believe we're going to resume with direct examination of Mr. Bierman. Ms. D?
I think we were still talking about some of the work that was done by Ms. Johnson following the report on July 29th of 1992.
Right.
And I believe you had just told us that it appears from the records that that Antoinette Smith was able to obtain housing in, I believe you said you thought it was January.
That's correct.
Had something significant happened about 1 month prior to that move-in date?
Yes, Travion was born right around that time, prior to it.
And you told us earlier that you knew when Travion was born because his birthday is listed in the records.
It is, but it was interesting that you had to travel a little further into the record to realize that he had been born. The record didn't really capture his birth. I was surprised at that. I expected a social worker would put in there that this significant event in the life of this family happened, but it just, suddenly there were 2 children and not 1.
So there's no mention in the record of Travion being born?
No, not the way I would have expected it, with some anticipation, some effort to provide resources, and an acknowledgement that this significant event was happening in this family.
And it may be obvious, but why would the birth of an additional child be a significant event in a family that was going through the process of working with the Department of Social Services?
Well, it would be significant because the issue for the Department of Social Services is always the safety of the child and trying to help the family develop strength and capacity, and when to nurture a child to live in the world. And when a child comes along, this is a high stress time. There is no, in our spectrum of life, that is one of those places in life where human beings are incredibly vulnerable when they're very, very little. So you need special tools to take care of them, special resources, and a capacity to know how to nurture them and to get them through those early times. Plus, it is also a time of, for many parents, a time of sort of hope and opportunity that you can work with parents to help them figure out, how am I going to make this work? Now, particularly, even though there's no mention of it in the record, and it relates to what we were saying earlier, particularly in a record where you find that there were other children born to Antoinette who were no longer in her care. So this is a real opportunity, and it seemed I was kind of confused and mystified by its virtual absence in the record.
And would it also be an opportunity to talk about some of the bonding issues that had been addressed by the earlier social worker?
Yes, it would have been bonding issues. It would have been an opportunity to bring people into the home, and there are resources that can do that, to help teach about bonding and health issues, and there just was no attention to that at all.
And were there any other significant issues raised in that July 1992 report?
The issue that was raised that was heard in the early, read in the early part of the record, was an acknowledgement by a staff member at the Salvation Army that they suspected that Antoinette was using drugs or alcohol, that she was away for long periods of the day. That was another curiosity from the perspective of it didn't get much attention. And in some ways it makes sense from the perspective of they were trying to get a roof over her head and trying to get her stable, but it did not get the attention of the social workers at that point.
So I'd like to turn now to the next Child Protective Services report that is in the set of records that you were asked to review.
Right.
What's the date of that next report?
October 28th, 1993.
And so in October of 1993, was Antoinette's case still open at the Department of Social Services?
It appears to me that it depends how you define open. That there was some evidence that the last social worker, Ms. Hall, declared it closed in April, but in the electronic records, it remained open. So technically, it was still open. It's not clear to me that there was an active social worker at that point.
Okay. And so you mentioned Ms. Hall. Do you remember when she took over?
Yes, she was after Ms. After Ms. Johnson. Ms. Hall took over in February of '93 and had the case open for 2 months.
And then what happened on October 28, 1993?
Well, on October 28, 1993, the Wake DSS gets a report, an allegation from Ms. Cannon and Ms. White, who are neighbors, and they report that in their interaction with this family, that these two young children, age 10 months and 2.5, I believe, are living in a home that has no heat. And the only source of heat is an open oven. That there's no hot water, dirty clothes, children's diapers aren't changed. They're concerned about nutrition. The children seem hungry. and that in general that there was a failure on the part of the mother to supervise and provide for the children. So the worker, newly assigned social worker, who's new to the case, goes in and essentially says, walking in the home, I immediately saw what was described in the report, that things were disheveled. There were bottles that had crusty residue on them and in them. The children seemed to have diapers that needed to be changed, and so she proceeded to investigate and work with the mom to start remedying those what she found.
And was the oven that had been described, was that something that the social worker found when she got there?
Sorry.
The oven provided?
Yes. I mean, she found that was their only source of heat, and she was particularly concerned with a child who was mobile, getting close to that heat source, and a pretty unsafe situation.
And does that section of the record begin around B2851?
Yes, that's the intake form.
And is there a reference on that initial front page to any sort of injury to Travion?
Yes, it was curious. On the very first line where it says abuse, and it's checked, and what it says is burned hand approximately 2 months ago. Then that's crossed out, and neglect is checked, and it says improper care, or the abbreviations for improper care and supervision, in a different handwriting. So it looked to me like a supervisor came in and changed that, crossed that first line out and changed that to improper care and supervision.
But there's not any narrative that sort of explains that change.
No, there really isn't.
So you've told us that it was the two neighbors that made that report.
That's right.
And you told us that the social worker did the investigation and found the situation in the home was as described by the complainants. Do you remember, was that report of abuse or neglect substantiated?
Yes, it was. It was substantiated for neglect.
And there is a document in there called the Family Risk Assessment.
Right.
Is that a form or a document that was often used as part of these investigations by social workers for the Department of Social Services?
It was there are 2 or 3 of them completed in the record. It was not a standard form in North Carolina. I think it was adopted in Wake County. Wake's always been a county that was kind of a forward-thinking and doing creative and interesting things, and I suspect it was part of a trend because we now see those in all counties.
And so it was a document that went through and called upon the social worker to evaluate the home in many, many different categories.
It did, many dimensions.
And is there any reference, or can you tell us about some of the findings on the family risk assessment that was done as a result of the report of abuse or neglect in October of 1993? Yes,
I thought the worker found some significant elements in the. In order to read them, I have to find my glasses. But one of the things she found was there's a section that's entitled Caretaker Assessment Factors, where what they wanted to look at there was how able is the caregiver for this child to care for the child. And in the first item, they mention intellectual disability interferes with ability to provide care. And that's the first mention in the record, that there's an intellectual disability. They go on and talk about, at the bottom of that page, caretaker substance or alcohol misuse. The social worker describes it as moderate substance abuse. And then in terms of emotional and mental health, is describing caretaker is currently exhibiting behavior which may be a sign of, it looks to me like depression, mental health, and help is not being sought. So what she describes is some significant issues that would have an impact on a parent's ability to care for a child.
And you mentioned that was the first time that there was any reference to the possibility of depression or intellectual limitations. Is that also the first time that one of the social workers notes on the record concerns about a drug or alcohol abuse?
It's the first time that, remember I mentioned earlier that the Salvation Army, it was captured by the social worker who, when they, in the first report, when he went to the Salvation Army. But it's the first time that sort of the dots have been connected, that there is maybe something to that.
Is Travion's father, Michael Clark, mentioned in this report?
Yes, it's the first mention of him. It's mentioned in the intake part of the of this report, and it says that at the time of the report that he's incarcerated.
And Laura Cannon, who makes the report along with Claudia White, right? Those are the two neighbors that make the report.
That's right.
What, if anything, did we learn about her at the time of the report?
Well, I think we learned that this report describes her as a neighbor, and yes, a neighbor and an interested person.
And was there anything striking to you about the case record in the months following the October 1993 report?
Yes, and it relates to the what I described earlier in terms of the kind of stress that this system was under, caseloads, turnover, etc. This, as I was reading through this, the case comes in October of 1993, and the dictation, which is the printed narrative, is dated 13 months later, and it's dated 1995, I believe. For somebody who's done the work that I've done, this is one of those serious red flags. What in the world is going on that a social worker would wait that long to dictate? It means to me, I mean, I thought to myself, I have trouble remembering detailed information over that long a period of time. But I thought to myself, that's really, what the worker did was pretty solid. But recording it that late means that there are things that just are not going to be there.
So, were there any other? There are two more reports that you were asked to review, correct?
Right.
And they were, I think you said, investigated sort of simultaneously. But what was the date on the first of those two reports?
The first of those two close reports came in January of '94. It was an anonymous report The person walked into the department. It's kind of unusual for a person to walk in. Most of these reports come via phone or, so they took the report, and this is the one that was, nothing was done on it for a month because the case was, what it says on the record is, the case was lost in the office. The report of it was lost. So the next report comes, yeah.
So that came in as an anonymous report.
It did.
But were you able later to figure out who it was that made that report?
Yes, it was the same reporter from the October report, October '93, Ms. White, who on making this the second report, let's call it the final report, acknowledges that she had made this anonymous report earlier. So she's been involved in these last three reports.
So Ms. White made the report that we were just talking about in October.
Right.
And then we know that she made the anonymous report, if I understood you correctly, because in the February report where she gives her name, they refer back to the
Right.
fact that she made the report
Right.
the month before.
Yeah, she refers back to it.
And before we move away from the January report, can you just tell us what the nature of that report was?
The nature of the report was that a continuation of the failure to provide adequate care and supervision related to nutrition of the children, health of the children, and on one of these there was a report of the children being observed, another adult putting beer in a baby bottle and handing it to the child, and the child drinking the beer, and the mom not doing anything about that.
And how old would Travion have been in January of 1994?
Would have been in the January of '94 in the. Depends on. I did not do my calculations on that. In the 2.5 range, I believe.
Or had just turned 2?
Yeah.
So I think you've indicated that by the time the January report was found in the office, that another report had been made, and that's the February report.
That's right.
And what's the exact date of the February report?
It's the 16th of February.
Then we're still in 1990.
94.
And Miss White made that report,
She did make that report, yes.
and that's the third of the 3 reports she makes.
That's correct.
And what was the nature of that report?
The nature of that report, again, the two were quite similar that in terms of care and supervision. In one of these reports, there was the statement that there had been medicine in the refrigerator that had been dated and unused. As I said earlier, the beer in the bottle. She also, at that point, mentions Ms. Cannon in this, that Ms. Cannon, who had been involved in making the first report, she describes as having been, I think the term she used was tearing up Travion, and Ms. White in that report objects to whatever that tearing up meant. It was clear that Ms. White and Ms. Cannon had been involved in some forms or fashions with caregiving for both children.
For a period of time.
For a period of time.
And do you remember the nickname that is used when Miss White is speaking about Travion Smith in these records?
I think it's Pico.
And so in that, are some of these intake reports handwritten and some of them are typed?
That's correct, yes.
And in the report that we're looking at here, the one from February of 94, is the handwritten, is that a handwritten or a typed report? Do you remember?
That's the intake report, is a handwritten report.
And do you remember whether that report is on just one side of the page, or was it on two sides of the page?
That was an unusual one in that it was two sides of the page, and there were other reports that we had looked at that there should have been a second page because there was an arrow there and they stopped mid-sentence. This one, the arrow was there and we actually had the page.
So of all the records you looked at, this is the only one where the handwriting said there was a second page and there was actually a second page.
That's
there.
correct, yes.
And is it on that second page where there's the reference to Laura Cannon? I don't remember exactly what you said, but does it tearing up Pico's butt sound familiar?
Yes.
And that was on that back page?
That was on that second page.
So this was a Child Protective Services report about Antoinette Smith, correct?
Correct.
And the bulk of the issues that Miss White is raising, are they mostly about Antoinette?
Would you repeat that? Sorry, I was...
Miss White does she raise a number of different issues in this report?
Mm-hmm.
And are those issues similar to the issues she
Yes,
raised
they
in
are.
the report?
Sorry.
And are those things that she would like to draw the attention of Child Protective Services to?
Yes.
And who is the person who she is primarily trying to get Child Protective Services to focus their attention on?
Well, at this point on Travion, just because he's the youngest.
And who's his caregiver that she's so concerned?
Well, she's concerned, and that's part of what the record is showing is that Ms. Cannon has become kind of a de facto caregiver in an informal fashion. There's nothing in the record that says Mom made this decision or Dad made this decision, but that Ms. Cannon is providing some care before school, after school, in some sort of level of informal care.
And Ms. White has some concerns about that as well?
Yes.
So when was this case closed?
Well, this case was this was another one of those that was just a little bit confusing in terms of these two cases were kind of combined, said into one, and the investigation happened around in February of '94. But it was, and I'll have to go dig in to look at the date. It was closed pretty quickly thereafter. What concerned me about this was with these two reports, very similar. There really was no evidence that or description of an investigation. That there was a home visit. There was no description of what they did, what they saw, what they found, other than, and it makes sense for one of them because it was a month old. But for the newer one, there simply was no, what I would say, in my opinion, there was no significant investigation. I've described, this is a very prescribed world where you have to do things in an orderly way and with time frames and always with a focus on safety for children. And there's some evidence in the early part of the record. There's some instances where that happened. This is one where it just didn't happen.
Was a finding of abuse or neglect substantiated with those last two reports?
No.
And is it clear to you why that decision was made?
Well, from my perspective, that decision was made, at least on the first report, because of the time, the month that elapsed. On the second report, it's not clear because there was very little contact to confirm or to make a decision. And I'm saying that relative to some of the other records, that in the records where the two where neglect was substantiated, there was a process described in the records. And you could understand sort of what they did and how they did it and how they came to conclusion. There was nothing described similarly in this record.
And nothing documented.
And very little documented.
Your Honor, if we could take that brief switch that we mentioned earlier.
So, ladies and gentlemen, there's a witness that the defense intends to call that has a plane to catch, I think, very shortly. And so we're going to ask this witness to step down. We're going to allow the other witness to be called and allow the state opportunity to cross-examine that witness. Then we'll recall Mr. Bierman.
Place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand. Please solemnly swear the testimony you give this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you, sir. Have a seat, please.
Misty?
Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Aaron Tremaine Magruder, and I am Travion Smith's brother.
You and Travion have, so you're Travion's brother through his mom or through his dad?
Yes, through his mom.
And how many brothers do you have through your mom?
4.
4 including you, or 4 total?
I'm sorry, yes, 3.
3.
Yes, 4 of us in total.
And so who's the oldest, and just sort of, can you go through the 4 of you?
Darius is the oldest, and then Corey is the second oldest, and then there's me, and then Travion is the youngest.
And so how close are you and Travion in age?
About 2 years apart.
And when were you born?
I was born April 12, 1991.
And so Travion was born the end of well, tell me when Travion was born. Was it December of 1992?
Yeah.
And when you were young, who did you live with? When you were
I lived with my grandmother and my great aunt.
So when did you go to live with your grandmother and your great aunt?
Well, they told me when I was 3.
Okay.
So.
So you don't have any, do you have any memories from before you lived with your grandmom and your great aunt?
Not really.
So do you know from being told who you lived with before you went to live full time with your grandmother?
Yes.
And who was that?
With my mom. They told me that pretty much the story is that, my mom had me up until, the point I was 3, while at that time it was her and my father. They were staying in Raleigh North, and I went to go stay with them, and I've been with her ever since.
And when you say her and your father, you mean who's her?
With my grandma, Earldine Bailey.
And your father?
It's Terrace Magruder.
Okay. So when you were about 3, you went to stay with your grandmother, Earldine Bailey, and your father, Terrace Magruder, and your great aunt,
Geraldine Bailey, yes.
Did she also live with you when you were little?
Yes.
Now, so you grew up here in Raleigh?
Yes.
And did you graduate from high school?
Yes, I did, from Broughton High School.
And what did you do when you finished high school?
I went to the Marine Corps. I went to boot camp 4 days after graduation, 2009.
And why did you think it would be a good idea to join the Marine
Well, being in military is something that I always had thought about doing, and I knew like in my future it would definitely be something great as far as going off to college, which I did afterwards, and other opportunities. So, I just went in straight after high school. Didn't want to get in any trouble or nothing, so no need in wasting time.
And were there other men in your family who you didn't want to choose the same path as?
Yes, pretty much. From far as I know, from what I've seen and what other family members have told me, I only have a couple of family members that went to college. Most of them have criminal backgrounds, including my father. So I definitely didn't want to go down that same path.
And was there anybody when you were growing up that was on you about that?
Yes, my grandma. My grandma, Earlene Bailey, and my great aunt as well.
Was that a message that you heard often?
Yes, because, from my great aunt, her son as well, he was also incarcerated. So, just from them, from that generation to being able to, now raising the next generation to help, change that course. So I'm greatly appreciative of that.
So you told us that you went to live with your grandma when you were 3, and when you were a kid, and sort of before, that kind of teenage years, did you see much of your mom?
Yes, I did see her sometimes. From most of the memories I can recall were times where she would come and get me, like when she came and got me from my grandma. It may have been like an hour or two. I don't have too many memories of us being together like that, but the few times they were times where she would come and get me from my grandmother.
So you remember that she would come and get you every now and then for a couple hours?
Yes.
And would you sometimes see her in Franklinton?
From early childhood, I can't remember. Later in childhood, maybe when I was around teenage age, and for like family gatherings and stuff like that. But I can't remember from the earlier ages,
Okay.
6 and under.
So when you were older, you think you saw her more than up at family gatherings? And just remind us who lives in Franklinton.
Yes, my grandmother and my grandfather.
And that's your maternal?
Yes, that's my mother's parents.
And what are their names?
Louise Smith and Edward Smith.
And did you have siblings that lived up there in Franklinton as well?
Yes, my older brothers Darius and Corey.
And does your grandmother, Earl Dean, does she have a good relationship with the Smiths?
Yes, very good. She used to make sure I would get up there a lot of times on weekends, and I would stay for 2 to 3 week duration periods in the summertime. We'd go on family vacations to Virginia and things like that. So she always made sure that I was able to see them as much as possible.
Did it seem when you were growing up like she made that a priority?
Yes, yes.
And does she still have a relationship with the Smiths?
Yes, actually, when I graduated from college, they came down there all together. My grandma, Earl Dean, and my mom's parents and my father, they all came down to Florida to come to my graduation.
To be there and support you?
Yes.
And they did that all together?
Yes.
Did there come a time when you decided to make an effort to know your mother better?
Yes. I would say around the time of starting from the age of maybe around like 18, 19, after being in the Marine Corps and just, being an adult or becoming an adult, being able to understand more things about, that relationship or lack thereof. I try to make efforts to try to stimulate, as an adult, try to have some type of adult relationship.
And you're the one that made those efforts?
Yes.
Do you know when your mom's birthday is?
I did, and then I forgot. I couldn't say at the moment now.
So I want to talk a little bit more about your relationship with Travion.
Mm-hmm.
And did you have a nickname you called him by as a kid?
Yes, Pico.
And do you still call him Pico, or do you call him Travion?
Yes, Pico or Travion. More, excuse me, more Travion now as an adult, but still sometimes Pico.
And when you were little, were you and Pico close?
Yes. Yes.
And how was it for you when the two of you weren't together anymore?
Well, it was kind of troubling for me because being raised with my grandma and my great aunt, obviously they're much older women, and me being pretty much like the only child scenario in the household. So, that's why I think it was so important that my grandma, that she always tried to make sure I can have those relationships because, growing up with them is kind of like an only child, and, in the circumstance in which she had took me to the daycare and he didn't remember me, being a child, I couldn't really understand, like, why you don't remember me, like, I'm your brother. But so those are kind of heartfelt moments,
And do you still remember how that made you feel?
Yes.
And when you were together, when you were kids, what would it be like when you were together?
Well, it's one prolific moment that I always remember is I'm not sure where we were staying out or where my mom was, but it was a time when she had both of us, and I was asking her for something to eat, something like that, and I can't remember exactly what the situation was, whether she was busy doing something or whether, I was a kid impatient. I must have been maybe like 5. And I climbed on the counter and got the bowls. I remember it was some Captain Crunch with the fruit berries in it. And I made us some cereal. Didn't spill the cereal pouring the bowl, but I spilled milk everywhere. So that's one of the major times that I remember of us being together, other than different, singular experiences, like, when we went on a family trip and stuff like that.
May I put you on?
Yes.
Aaron, I'm going to show you what's been labeled as Defendant's Exhibit 16. And can you take a look at that and tell me if you can tell us what that picture is of?
Oh, yeah, this was a picture at my grandmother's house, my grandma Louise in Franklinton.
So
I can't recall the exact event, but it's starting to brush up some memories. This picture.
and who's in that picture?
This is me and my brother Travion.
And is that a fair and accurate picture of what the two of you looked like at that age?
Yes.
And would that help you to illustrate your testimony about what it would be like when the two of you were together?
Yes, because all of us, all my brothers, we're kind of like 1.5 to 2 years apart. So when you're younger, that makes a whole lot more difference, than when you get in your 20s. So it would be kind of like, like me and him, since we're closer in age, like the younger ones, and wow, I'm really trying to recollect what this particular event was, but.
And did Travion, how did he act towards you as his older brother?
I think he looked up to me a lot, more so is because I was, that closer in age. It was more relatable, versus, our other brothers being a little bit older. They maybe had different friends, different like interests and stuff. So me and him were more closer in the things that we liked, similarities and stuff like that.
And so how would he act when he was around you? When he was
pretty much excited, very excited, playful. I think he was just really excited to be around all of us because the times were very few and in between. So, it was really like joyful for him, when we could all be together.
Do you wish that you had been able to see your brother more when you were growing up?
Yes, I do.
And do you love your brother?
Yes, I do.
And do you want him to be a part of your life?
Yes, I do.
And you say that he would and be playful with all of the brothers. Did you have any other chances to sort of see him around groups of kids, or was it pretty much just when the four of you would be together?
It would pretty much just be with us, as far as I can remember. I mean, maybe there were times when, I have a lot of cousins on that side. They may have been around for different family events, but, particularly like when he'd be around, you kind of be like focused, on him, as far as me, like being focused on spending time with him. So if it was any other kids, it would probably be, cousins in the family, but not as far as like, at like a park or a playground where there's, kids outside of the family, anything like that. I can't recall.
And were you so focused on just seeing him at those times because it was so rare that you got to see him?
Yes.
I don't have any other questions.
Cross-examination, Mr. Waller.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Magruder, am I saying that correctly?
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon, yourself.
Tell us a little bit about when did you graduate from Broughton High School?
June 9th, 2009.
And then you said you went directly into the Marine Corps?
June 15th, 2009.
And what did you do there in the military, sir?
My specialty, I was a welder.
A welder?
Mm-hmm.
And where all were you stationed?
I was stationed in Jacksonville, North Carolina. It's about 2 hours southwest of here.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And did you spend the entire
4
years at
my entire time I was stationed there, yes, but I went to Aberdeen, Maryland for my school training, and then I deployed in 2011 when I went on what's called a MU, Marine Expeditionary Unit, which is like a joint task force with the Navy, pretty much like America's 911 call, when we go to the Mediterranean in 2011 when all that stuff was happening in Egypt and Libya. And I was over there for a while, for 11 months. And other than that, I was in Jacksonville, Camp Lejeune.
And you said you were in the military 4 years?
Yes.
When were you discharged?
I got out June 14th, 2013.
And then what did you decide to do, Mr. Magruder?
I moved down to Florida. I went to Full Sail University.
Which university?
Full Sail University.
And what did you major in there?
Recording engineering.
And I believe you told us a few minutes ago about how you graduated from college.
Yes.
Okay. And what are you doing now, Mr. Magruder?
Right now, I'm currently in barbering school, the barbering program at Westside Technical College.
Okay. And I believe your grandma, who's very proud of you, said that you're married.
Yes, I am.
And do you have a child?
Yes, 6-year-old girl.
Your grandmother that I mentioned, she a hard-working lady?
Yeah, she is. She's been like that since I was little. I remember, I have to wake her up in the night because she's snoring the times that she had off, because she's always in and out of work trying to support not only myself but so many other family members and stuff.
And it sounds like she provided for you and did the best that she could.
Yeah, she absolutely did.
And it sounds like maybe not a lavish lifestyle, but you were well taken care of.
Yeah, she made sure I had all the necessities. Anytime there was a school trip, field trip, anything like that coming up, she would always make sure she had it for that. A lot of times it would be my fault because I would tell her too late, But if I told her with enough time to prepare, she would make sure, she had everything for me.
Ms. D asked you about some questions, or asked you about Travion growing up. But as you got into your teenage years, did you and Travion maintain a relationship together?
I seen him a couple times in passing, like sometimes he would just stop by the house. I'll be coming from school or getting ready to go out places, because when I joined the Marine Corps, I joined like at the end of the DEP program, which is when you're waiting to go to boot camp. I was in there for all of my senior year, so a lot of the times outside of school I would be there doing training and different events and stuff like that, so I was pretty active. So I would see him sometimes in passing, or he stopped by the house here and there.
And both of y'all would be teenagers at this point?
Yes.
Okay. And when your grandmother was testifying, and then I think you mentioned it a while ago that Travion looked up to you, and I think maybe your grandma said that maybe you took him under your wing at times. When you were teenagers, did you try and give Travion some advice on life, and like she said, take him under your wing?
Well, yeah, I always try to encourage him to, just stay in school and do the right thing, because coming from the background and from my own family experience, seeing what not going to school and what not doing certain things or doing certain things leads to, I had a plan for myself to stay on the right path, and I always tried to encourage him to do the same thing.
Was he receptive towards your advice or for your advice?
He seemed receptive. Yeah, he seemed very receptive at the time, very glad, and seemed like he considered what I had to say.
Do you know if he continued on in his education?
That I do not know.
Okay. And your grandmother mentioned that you had concern about him hanging out with gangs and associating with those type of people.
Well, yes. I never seen him do with any gang members or any type of particular setting where I could clearly identify as a gang. But like I said, coming from from my background and different experiences with family members and other high school companions and stuff, then you kind of notice certain symptoms or certain signs that could lead you towards that direction. If you're not focused, it could be easy to fall into things that you don't want to be a part of if you're not focused on doing what you're supposed to be doing. So I would just try to always encourage him, stay in school and try to do your best in your situation to stay away from that.
And were you noticing signs from Travion that he may be involved with gangs?
No, there was no direct or particular signs I can recall. I mean, such as the instance, like if he comes over because he skipped school that day or whatever, being out of school leaves you with a lot of time to be in trouble, or to potentially get in trouble. So those are like red flags that I would say, hey, stay in school, because you could find yourself doing things that you're not supposed to. But there was never a particular instance where I seen him doing something that was specifically I could identify as gang related. But
you had some concerns?
Yes.
And Mr. Magruder, were you ever in a gang?
No, sir.
Mr. Magruder, thank you for your service, and thank you for being here.
No, thank you.
No further questions.
Ms. D.
Mr. Waller asked you some questions about the fact that you were well taken care of when you were growing up.
Yes.
That your grandma worked hard, and it wasn't easy, but you were well taken care of.
Yes.
And you always had clothes.
Yes.
You had clothes that fit you.
Yes.
And you had food to eat.
Yes.
Was your impression growing up that your brother Travion was similarly well taken care of?
No. A lot of times, like the particular time when I gave him some of my clothes, they couldn't fit me at the time, but also it was just seeing, how much when I would see him, it seemed like he was in need, of not just material things, but in just somebody that cares, you know, and like it's like one of those things you can't really define it or put it in words, but you know, as humans, we can all feel that type of connection when you feel somebody is lacking something, you know. So in those times, you know, my grandma always take time to feed them, and you know, whether that's a meal in the house or we would go by Bojangles. Bojangles was very close to you know, where my grandma still currently stays. So, you know, I would always try to do anything I can when I did get the chance to see him to try to encourage him, you know, to do good, you know, do good and do what's right. And, you know, I wish I could have had more of those opportunities, but, you know, in the time frame and the circumstances, I didn't really, you know, have the means, being so busy and stuff and not knowing, you know, his living situation or his you know, circumstances. It seemed like it was unstable, you know, so.
So you felt that he had a need for material things and for emotional things?
Yes.
And you tried to give him the help that you could?
Yes.
Mr. Waller, anything further?
If Travion had to come to you and asked you for help, you would have given it to him, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You may step down. If you could have Mr. Bierman return to the stand. And Mr. Bierman, you recognize you're still under oath, sir?
Yes.
All right, very good.
Thanks,
Ms. D.
Final question about the remainder of the record before the case is closed. And I believe you told us the final date on any of the records that you reviewed was April of 1995. You told us that at
That's
the
right.
beginning of your testimony.
Yes.
And so now we were discussing the investigation following the complaint of February 16th, 1994. So what can you tell us, what do the records say about the time period between February of 1994 and April of 1995, about the services that were provided to Antoinette or about Travion's living arrangements?
The services between February and were after those two referrals, there were very limited services until January of 1995. Limited, and it's again there were a couple of again the record is so incomplete. There were in 1994 two speed memos from Ms. Eigelman, who was the social worker, to Ms. Smith, but that was all that was in there. And I don't know what those. They were simply please call me.
At some point during that span of time, do the documents reflect that both Aaron and Travion were living with people besides Antoinette?
Yes. And again, that's another sort of piece of mystery, that there is no clear statement of saying that how that happened and when it happened and why it happened. But yes, it shows that they are each living with a different caregiver.
And so you can tell that basically because there are documents in there that reflect that information?
Yeah, they were both getting child daycare, for example, and so there was some documentation in there about where they were living, and some documentation that first, I think there was a statement that Ms. Cannon was providing after, either before or maybe both, but before or after school care for Travion, and then there was additional discussion down the road of her providing more care for him, essentially becoming his guardian.
So if I can turn your attention to page B2884.
Yes.
And what type of document is that?
This is called a child welfare face sheet. It's used to transmit information.
And is it used to transmit information at a specific time in the case record, or is it used at different times?
The way it looks to be used in here, it's transmitted at a time when there is some additional activity anticipated or requested.
Okay. And can you tell from the record what that anticipated or predicted activity was at this time, or?
Well, it looked to me like it's followed. There are two face sheets, and it's not clear to me what's being anticipated. It's followed by, curiously enough, a request for a criminal background check on Ms. Smith, and then followed by another face sheet that is related to Ms. Bailey, who had become Aaron's guardian caregiver. So this looks like this is the documentation, at least, that both children are in have been given other caregivers.
And if you go back to page B2884, is there a specific reference on that page to where each of the children are living?
Yes, and it describes each of them. There's a section in there that says victim children placed out of their parents' homes, and it has Aaron being with Earlene Bailey and Travion being with Lori Cannon, and it gives addresses in a little detail.
And Lori Cannon had been at an address on Hairsnipe Court before. Does she appear to have a different address?
She does.
And does the document that you're looking at indicate what the placement date was for each of the children to be in their out-of-home placements?
It shows, the only date that's shown on there is for Earlene Bailey for Aaron, which is 9/94. Now, that could mean that was true for both of them, but that's the only date that's on there.
Okay. So it's clear from the document that Aaron was with Earlene Bailey by September of 1994, and slightly less clear of what the move date was for Travion Smith to the custody of Lori Cannon.
Correct.
Did DSS complete a home visit related to this placement?
Well, there was a home visit made to Ms. Bailey, and this was at a time where the standard would have been an expectation of the social work that if the social worker finds that there is a kinship placement that has been made, and that's what this would have been, was one member of the family turning over the responsibility for care of a child to either to another family member or to somebody close to the family. That the standard would have been visit the house, evaluate for safety, make sure that the child is has their it's a relatively low standard in terms of that they've got a place to sleep, that they're safe, that they've got running water, that the caregivers are capable of caring for them. That happened for Ms. Bailey, and there's documentation in the record that occurred.
And let me ask you a couple follow-up questions there. So that type of placement is called a kinship placement?
Right.
Because, and if I understand what you're saying, because the parent is involved in helping to make the decision to place it with this family member.
That's correct.
And what you just described, you said there was a fairly low level of standard that had to be met for that placement to be acceptable.
That's right.
And is that partly because it was this special type of placement, the kinship placement?
Yes, and partly because of the way the law was written at the time. There really was less. There were not well-developed standards for kinship care, as opposed to foster care. Where there were standards for the size of rooms and et cetera. But it was a general standard that was presumed that you would have a place for a child to sleep, that it was a safe environment, it wasn't injurious, and you're not selling the child. I mean, that you're looking for just real basic information.
And on this page that we've just been talking about, where there's the section that you read from where it said victim children placed outside their parents' home, and it lists Earldine Bailey as being the current guardian for Aaron Magruder, and Lori Cannon as being the current guardian for Travion Smith.
Right.
Does that form also list what the relationship of those two individuals?
That's I don't.
On 2884?
I don't see that on that form. The what I noted over the course of looking through the record. Now, Ms. Bailey's always been a grandparent.
Correct.
Ms. Cannon has evolved.
And if you look there, right next to her name, do you see some words and letters right there describing her relationship?
Yeah, it does say it's crossed through, and I didn't have my glasses on. Look, it could say paternal aunt.
And when you say her relationship has evolved, is that what you meant?
Well, what I meant was that initially she was described as a neighbor, and then toward the end of the record, she's described as an aunt.
And is there ever any attempt made to clarify as to whether she is actually just a former neighbor or really a paternal aunt? Is there any narrative about?
Yes, in one of the narratives it says that the Travion's father, that she and Travion's father are brother and sister.
Okay. So according to the narrative, Travion's father told them that, or somebody told them that.
That's where it probably would have come from.
And is there any narrative in here about the fact that there had been concerns raised in that prior CPS report by Claudia White?
No. Now again, remember that was that CPS report that got lost and got combined. So it was one where I had real concerns about the lack of focus in that report.
But none of the other later reports that designate Lori Cannon as Travion's guardian make any reference to that prior CPS
No.
report? And who does it appear from the record that Travion was living with for the remainder of the time that the case was open?
With Ms. Cannon, it would appear.
And DSS never completed any sort of kinship evaluation for the placement of Travion in her home.
No, I saw absolutely no evidence that they ever visited Ms. Cannon's home or his father's home. Now, there's a lot of evidence that there were phone calls back and forth that related to eligibility for AFDC and child daycare.
Questions about who was going to get the money.
These were valuable resources.
And you mentioned that there was a kinship placement evaluation done with regards to Aaron and his grandmother, Earl Dean.
Yes, and it was pretty standard for the time. It was a visit and conversation and, just eyes on this grandmother and her space.
And was another one of the family risk assessments done prior to this case being closed?
Yes.
And in that family risk assessment, is there any reference to an evaluation of the environmental condition of the home where either of the children are living?
Yes, yes, for Aaron, but nothing for Travion.
So if you go to page 2899, is that the reference in the family risk assessment?
Yes.
And what is the assessment of the social worker about the environmental conditions in the home that Aaron's living in?
It says very good
Is there any mark after very good?
with an exclamation point.
And what is the assessment of the environmental condition of the home in which Travion's living?
It's got the abbreviation for unknown.
After reading the records that you were asked to review in this case regarding the Child Protective Services reports related to Antoinette Smith and her younger children, did you form any opinion about the nature or quality of the services provided to Antoinette during that time?
Yes, I did.
And what was that opinion?
Well, there are three primary. One is in looking at this record and then reflecting on the time I spent in that world and the years from 1990 to that whole decade really was a time when the system, both the state system and the county systems, they're really locked together. This was a bad time, a difficult time to provide services. This case is a really good example of the impact of high caseloads, the impact of significant turnover. The social workers, as I reviewed this, there was a range of work in here. Some of the work was good, and some of it, particularly the work that provided them with, in the 92 referral, provided them with housing and gave them some stability, some opportunity. That was good work. And I say, as a former college professor would say, that would be good, C+ to B work. The remainder of the record is filled, from my perspective, with a series of missed opportunities that, as I've been a social worker for 43 years, and what I learned was you really have to dig into the details of the case record, and you've got to understand what the issues are. The issues were laid out in terms of alcohol or drug abuse, then later laid out in terms of intellectual limitations. And there were some efforts in the record and the county did a good job of saying, okay, here are some of the things that we might do to help this mom be a better parent. And I'll just use one example, is that there was a reference in there to referring to a parent aid program. And in fact, Ms. Eigelman, one of the social workers, notes in the record that she spent some time helping Ms. Smith fill out an application to the parent aid program. But there was never any follow-up after that. That part of what we do as social workers is, in order to get people self-sufficient, you have to build a relationship with them that allows you to poke and prod a little bit and say, let's get this done. Let's go get in the car and do this. And it takes some time. And when you've got 30 cases, you just don't really have the capacity to do that. As my opinion, and as I looked at this record, was how hard this must have been for these social workers who had, like folks that go into my business, they have good hearts and they really want to make change happen for vulnerable people, but they were limited by caseload size, and it created lost opportunities. And for a family that had 2 young children, and that was, my opinion is that this is a case filled with possibilities that simply were not allowed to occur. They may not have occurred, but the opportunity to get them closer to occurring wasn't there because of these structural issues.
And was sufficient care taken, in your opinion, to maintaining Travion's safety and well-being?
I've struggled with that. Is that did they meet the minimum standard of the law? Some of the time they did. I would say in general, no. Early cases, yes. Later cases, they just dropped the ball.
And as the case moved from worker to worker, did each new or returning team member seem to have a working knowledge of what had happened previously with these children or their mother?
No, they had the big picture in terms of what's going on with this mom. They didn't have a clue. And I say that with all due respect, because these are people, the kind of folks that I worked with, but they were trying just to hold things together, do the very basic that they could to get a case closed and moved on.
And did it seem to you that the social workers who work on this case ever develop a meaningful relationship with Travion or his mother?
No.
And is that the type of relationship that you're talking about earlier that needs to be there in order to poke and prod?
It is the essence of how you make change happen with people. This is some people, giving people services doesn't create a relationship. It creates some safety for them. Creating a relationship allows you to help have a conversation, for example, about drug abuse, and about what do you do in that time that you're out. How are you going to be a better parent? That it opens those doors, and they never opened those doors. Never had the time to open them.
Cross-examination?
Mr. Bierman, just say that we're clear. If someone calls in a report to Child Protective Services, someone on the other end screens what the caller is saying. So, for example, if I have a concern about a child, I would call into a telephone number, and a person on the other end would write down the information that I'm giving them to the best that they can. Is that safe to say?
Correct.
And so when we're talking about things that were said by, for example, Miss White, and there was that one reference to tearing up his butt, and she didn't appreciate that discipline, that's someone else writing down what Miss White says.
Yes.
And your statement after that was, in that middle sort of report, after Travion's born, when he's young, and being taken care of in some fashion by Miss Cannon, Miss White said that isn't true, or tries to essentially recant that statement. Isn't that true?
So I'm not sure I understood your question.
You said that at some point she rejected or objected to the characterization of improper discipline in that report.
I don't think so.
You didn't say that she objects to any sort of harm by Miss Cannon? It wasn't your testimony?
No, I don't.
Okay.
That's not my
But
recollection.
in any event, Miss White's calling in and someone else is writing down.
Right.
Okay. And when any report comes in, whether it's a concern of neglect, a concern of abuse, a social worker then gets assigned to investigate it, whether it was back in 1991 or today.
Right.
And you would agree, wouldn't you, that given sort of the backlog and the concerns that you had in 1990 to 2000, that there have been a lot of changes and a lot of good changes to the system as a
Between
result?
now and then?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
And, you know, that's part of your studies and part of you working on this team is looking back at what we did wrong to try and fix it so it doesn't happen again.
Yes.
And the concerns that you talk about that are in Wake County were not endemic to Wake County. It was across the board.
Correct.
And that these social workers were doing the best that they could do.
Yes.
Okay. And you said, I kind of feel sorry for them or something like that. That they were in a difficult position. And so when that report comes in, again, whether it's 1990 and the caseloads are bigger than they should have been, someone is assigned to investigate the case. And after an investigation, whether it's short or lengthy, they make a decision of whether to substantiate it or to not substantiate it. Is that
Correct.
correct? And just generally speaking, not legally speaking, substantiation means there's evidence to support the concern of neglect or abuse. And the reverse would be true, that is, we've looked at this, we are not substantiating the case because we can't find any evidence that these things happened.
Correct.
And so in each time a report is made, a determination should be made by CPS one way or another, either yes, it might have happened, or no, we don't think it happened. Safe to
Yes.
say? And there are certain circumstances under which Child Protective Services can go in and take custody of children, isn't that correct?
Well, there are circumstances. I mean, that in it would in general, what happens is that if that's going to happen, before that happens, abuse or neglect would be substantiated, and you have to file a petition
With the court.
with the court to do that, unless it's a dire emergency.
Right. And there are certain grounds under which a petition, that is, CPS has done an investigation, they have concern for the safety of this children, they go before a judicial official and tell them, here's what we have, we want to essentially take custody of this child from this parent.
That's right.
And the basis for those are, for example, and again, I don't know exactly what the law was in 91, one, that the juvenile's been abandoned, two, that the juvenile has suffered physical injury or sexual abuse, three, that the juvenile is exposed to substantial risk of physical injury or sexual abuse because the parent, guardian, custodian, or caretaker has created conditions likely that this would happen. One, that the juvenile is in need of medical treatment and essentially the parents won't get it. Five, that the parent agrees to allow you to take custody. And the last one, number 6, is that the juveniles are run away and to secure their safety is in custody. Is that generally the law back even in 91?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. And so it's sort of in the extreme cases that Child Protective Services can assume custody of children that are in danger and then essentially are their guardians and can make decisions for them.
Correct.
If they don't, that is, we found that there may be some concerns and we want to transfer it, like you said. You've got an investigator, I've done this investigation, and now I'm transferring it to a treatment worker because we think this family needs some services.
Yes,
That can happen then and now.
that's right.
And the treatment worker would then assume custody, or not custody, would take over that caseload and work with the family on whatever the dynamics are, whether it's parenting, substance abuse, any combination of things. Is that safe to say?
Well, it's part of what they would work on. If you look back at these cases, what they tended to work on was particularly in the 92, is very concrete services because the family was living in a shelter.
Sure.
If in the ideal, if they had the time, then they would work on those issues. They identified them in this case, but they spent very little time actually working to solve some of those problems. And as I said earlier, they really never had the kind of relationship that would allow them to sort of move deeper into those areas.
Well, my question, Mr. Bierman, was not what happened in this case, but generally what's speaking. If it's transferred onto a treatment worker, then that person is to assist the family in whatever the needs may be.
Sure.
And without assuming custody of the child, they can make recommendations for the family to follow through on certain things. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And, you know, in an extreme case, I suppose a social worker could say, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and if the family doesn't do it, they could consider maybe that child is at greater risk, at extreme cases, correct?
Yes.
But it's incumbent on the parent to also do certain things. That is, if a recommendation is made, that a parent's supposed to follow through.
Sure.
And in these cases, there were several different reports that were made where, and we'll go in through them sort of individually, but where it appeared that Ms. Smith would make some progress, that is getting stable housing, which is sort of the cornerstone for any other thing. Obviously, you can't work on other issues if you're living in a shelter as well as you could under a roof. And so she would make some progress, and then it seems like perhaps there would be more reports indicating perhaps the progress wasn't kept. Is that safe to say? Would you agree?
Yes.
And so, in a general rule, without having custody of a child, a social worker makes recommendation, and then if you have that nice relationship, perhaps you can take the family to the appointment, or you can sort of make sure that they're going and follow through, which you said in an ideal world would have happened. And in this case, there were lots of different things that Ms. Smith in the early days was recommended to do. Isn't that safe to say?
Yes.
The majority of the reports, or excuse me, all of the reports presented some concerns for her oldest child in the home, clearly not her oldest child as we've learned, but Aaron Smith, now Magruder. He was involved in all of the reports, isn't that right?
Yes.
And then there came a period of time after which Travion was born that he was also the subject of several reports.
Yes.
And when you had testified that in January of '94, which is sort of the last set of reports that we talked about, wherein at some point he's no longer living with his mother, he would have been 2.5, but in reality he would have been just over 13 months old. Isn't that safe to say? If he was born in December of
Right.
'92,
Right.
he would have been about
Right.
13 or 14 months.
Right.
And so probably difficult to kind of talk to him about what's going on. Obviously, a social worker wants to get a sense from the child, but he would have been 13 months old. And from the time of the records that you reviewed, if we're looking at a time frame of April of 1995, all of the records that you reviewed concerned the birth of Travion up until he was about 2.5.
Okay. Yeah.
And you were not asked to review any additional records, is that safe to say?
That's correct.
So you don't know what types of opportunities might have been afforded to him after the April 1995 timeframe?
Correct.
For example, not his school records and whether he was
Right.
off. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with social workers or social workers in school that try to assist children and things of that regard.
Ms. Shakita, we'll go ahead and take a mid-afternoon break. We'll resume, ladies and gentlemen, at 4:15. If you'll recall all the instructions I've given you throughout the trial, leave your notebooks in your chairs. Everyone else, please remain seated while the jurors excuse themselves. Outside the presence of the jury, are there any matters we need to take up before we recess?
No, sir.
We'll be in recess at 4:15.